Welcome back. This is part 3 of the Chapter 22 AP Biology lecture. We're starting off this video with discussion on the evidence for evolution. We've got several different types of evidence for evolution. Each of these gets its own slide here in a few, so let's dive right in. Direct observation, we see we've got several instances that we can observe in real time today. We're going to talk through a couple of these. Color pattern in guppies. Your textbook does have full details. This is kind of a classic example, but we change the selective pressure on male guppies, and the color pattern changes. So those things don't necessarily have to be connected, but when the selective pressure changes, the phenotype changes. You'll see more when you look into the book. But essentially the selective pressure that we were manipulating is the predator. So these pike cichlids prey on adult guppies. These killfish, prey on juvenile guppies, which don't have the color genes. They have them, but they don't express them yet. And you can see how those change over time. We see HIV mutating like crazy. That's one of the reasons it's so hard to treat HIV, is because it's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. There's now a strain that kills people within 2 weeks of contraction, so it changes rapidly. We can also look at some introduced species, and we can see how that changes, because that's going to affect the fitness level. That's going to affect the food web. It's going to affect everything in the environment when a new species is introduced. So soapberry bugs are kind of a case study that your book talks through. And feeding is most effective when the beak length is closely matched to its seed depth. So that should sound familiar. That sounds a lot like Darwin's finches. In southern Florida, the bugs, you can see what they feed on. This native balloon vine has large fruit. They have longer beaks. In central Florida, they feed on the golden rain tree, which I don't know much about that. It does have smaller fruit, apparently, and so they have shorter beaks. So in the different regions of Florida, the beaks are different. Again, they're suited to their food source. You can see there's a correlation between fruit size and beak size in several other places of these same bugs. But in all cases, beak size has evolved in populations that feed on introduced plants with fruits that are smaller or larger than the native fruits. So really good examples of selective pressure causing a phenotypic change. You see in Florida, its evolution took less than 35 years. So survival success is a pretty strong selective pressure. Here's a graph that's showing our beak length. Notice that the pink line is in the same place on both axes. So here, this is on the native species that have bigger fruit. Our average beak size, or our beak size tends to be higher. Our average is right here. Notice that that's in museum specimens. So that shows like before that's like our before point. So before any changes have been made. We've got these big fruit, beaks get bigger. We have smaller fruit, beaks get smaller. Sorry, I stumbled through that. Another example of beak size relates to studying one population of birds over multiple years. We see after a dry year, beak size decreases. After wet years, the beak size increases. So we see these little bumps right there. Moving on to fossils. Fossils are relics of organisms that are gone. Make sure you're aware of the fact that they're not straight bones. They tend to be rock. They show changes over time from simple to complex, but we have an incomplete fossil record. Life definitely has changed over time, but we have gaps in the fossil record. We have many lines that appear to just go to extinction. And it's often hard to connect one small change from one generation to the next, because you're missing links. Maybe that's because the fossilization event didn't happen We have to, the organism has to die in almost a perfect spot for fossilization to happen. Only hard parts are going to fossilize well, so we're going to have a hard time figuring out the soft tissue of a dinosaur or something like that, something along those lines. It's tough to find fossils because things have moved around. Sometimes things are at the bottom of oceans or creek beds or river beds or something along those lines. There's going to be a bit of interpretation to do with fossil studies because sometimes you're going to have to reassemble the bones, and you're going to have to use your best judgment to reassemble the bones. And there certainly have been instances where we've been wrong. We've thought that a bone went here and it went there instead. So there certainly are issues with the fossil record. Next type of evidence is homology, meaning that we have a common ancestor, but we use these things differently so they become different over time. Notice long upper limb bone in all these organisms. The forelimbs are 2 bones in all these organisms. We've got hand-like structures. We've got tiny carpals that are wrist bones or leg bones if you're talking about the cat. Similar structure. Over time, we use them differently, so they become different. This one got webbing filled in and it got hollow, and this one got webbing around it and the fingers got funky shaped, and this one the fingers kind of fused together. This one the fingers stayed apart so we could grab things. So that suggests that over time we had a common ancestor. That's why the structure is similar, but then that we use them differently so they become different. Well, we have these vestigial organs. Whales have legs. Whales have back legs, and snakes have back legs. They have the bone structure, but they don't use them anymore, so they've lost the musculature. Humans sometimes are born with vestigial tails. Here's an example of a human that was born with a tail. Again, there's no real reason for that person to have that other than the fact that it's a homologous structure. It's a leftover vestigial organ. So the remodeling of these ancient structures changed their function or made it so that they didn't function anymore. Our appendix has less of a function than it does in other organisms. It doesn't have no function like we once thought, but it does less than some of our related species appendices do. There's homology in embryos. We see similar changes in embryonic development. You see here there are similar pharyngeal pouches and similar post-anal tails in a chick embryo and a human embryo. And we can look at several different types of embryos. You may come across Haeckel and Haeckel's lie, and I encourage you to investigate Haeckel's lie and why it was such a damaging thing for science and why ethics is such a huge thing. We're not going to talk about that directly in this video, but we will say that the photographs suggest a close comparison between the different species. The artistic drawings maybe were too close, maybe were too similar, maybe Haeckel manipulated those. Certainly it appears that Haeckel manipulated his results, but that shouldn't just disregard all this information. So I think we've kind of talked that into the ground. We have not talked a lot about convergent evolution. That's where unrelated organisms show similar adaptations. Kind of the classic examples are a seal and a penguin. They don't have real recent common ancestors, but swimming away from a shark is a pretty strong selective pressure. You're going to develop a hydrodynamic shape. You're going to be bullet shaped so you can shoot through the water. Similarly, sugar gliders and flying squirrels look really similar, even though they don't share a recent common ancestor. So again, suggests that similar selective pressures lead to similar phenotypes. Next up is biogeography, and that's the geographical distribution of species. We're going to have mixtures. We're going to have endemic species that are like marsupials are only found in Australia, so that's a trait that must have evolved after Australia broke away from the rest of the world. Darwin also noticed similar species in different ecosystems that were similar. So an African rainforest looks similar to a South American rainforest. They have the same types of organisms, same types of climate features, and those types of things. So they reflect descent from ancestors that colonized that area, and here you're seeing that. So Drosophila in Hawaii, there are different species on different islands where one fruit fly or maybe a pair of fruit flies have migrated from one island to the next. Maybe they've been taken with fruit, maybe they've flown, but they're definitely geographically isolated here, so mutations are going to accumulate. These flies are going to be different from these flies. Then when there's another migration 2 million years later, we get a third species, and then we get a fourth species. And that's just because they're isolated and they develop mutations. In molecular biology, more and more we see that our molecular evidence supports our direct observations. So we can do DNA sequences, and we can essentially use this fact right here to rewrite our phylogenetic trees. Universality of DNA as the genetic code does support a common ancestor. There are RNA-based life forms, but most life on Earth has DNA directions. Molecular data on relationships of vertebrates. So you're seeing number of amino acids that are different from our hemoglobin. Lamprey is significantly different than is a rhesus monkey. So again, more and more we see that our molecular data supports our phenotypic observations. So the genetics is really reinforcing the relatedness, and then we have to reevaluate our systems. We have to reevaluate our ideas. Does this still make sense in light of our genetic classifications? And overwhelmingly, we're seeing that yes, we were pretty close without having that DNA. The more similar a species is, the more closely related it is, the more similar its DNA sequences should be. So that's kind of the big ideas from chapter 22. Just to summarize, Darwin's ideas are a big T theory. Notice that big T theories have to make predictions that we have to be able to test. Be familiar with those pre-Darwinian views of evolution, what they said, how they affected Darwin, all those types of things. Know what Darwin's basis was, and then be able to discuss all that evidence that I covered in this video. So that's chapter 22.